room. We have a nice treat for us at this time. We have Patrick Laverty, who's going to talk on a very timely topic. I hack people for money, a day in the life of an information security professional. So we'll give our attention to Patrick for the next 20 minutes. Patrick, go ahead.
Thanks. All right, so my name is Patrick. I hack people for money. Is there anybody in here that is responsible for security? A couple of people, okay. That's great. So we have the usual who I am. I'm a professional penetration tester. I work for a company called Rapid7 out of Boston. I get to work from home, so I'm actually from right here, live in the next town over. Previously, I was a defender, worked for a company called Akamai Technologies, doing defense and protecting a lot of the websites that people have with Akamai. Before that, I was a builder. I worked for Brown University building websites for about 12 years. So I've been through the whole build it, defend it. Now I get to break it. So that's kind of fun. And like I mentioned, I work and live here as well. All right, so just a couple ground rules. I don't want to kind of go into anything too technical about this. This is just kind of what I do all day other than sit around in my pajamas and go on the computer. If there's a term that we kind of use that you don't understand, let me know, so that way it's not confusing or anything like that. This isn't going to be FUD. What does FUD mean? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Okay, so I'm not going to come in here and say the whole world's crashing in, the Russians are out to get you, or anything like that. Just kind of give you a little bit of an idea of some of the kinds of things that security professionals do. And it's definitely not sales. I don't do any kind of sales or anything like that. Every so often, somebody comes to me and says, well, can you sell us this? I'm like, I guess so. I'll put you in touch with the salespeople. So that last slide that had the name of my company on it is the last time you'll probably see that. So if you don't remember who I work for, that's awesome. Let's keep going. So I talked to Nick Inglis, who said, you know, why don't you come here and talk to people? So what do you want me to talk about? He says, what kind of ideas do you have? I said, well, how about let's just talk about my day? He said, sounds great. Let's do it. So every week I get a new victim, actually a new customer. So each week I get handed a new company to work with. And what sorts of things do we do with that company? Well, it's usually going to be for about 5 days. It depends on what they actually want tested, whether they want their website tested, their internal network, their external network. They might want, you know, can I get onto the wireless network? Can I get usernames, passwords out of this kind of stuff? Social engineering is a whole lot of fun. Social engineering is kind of a way that you can get people to give you information without them even knowing it. One of the things that I'm looking forward to doing through this presentation is also just kind of going over, you know, some little fun war stories here and there. Thought that kind of might be a fun way to illustrate some of the types of things that we do. One of my first social engineering jobs that I got to do was a company gave me 50 names and phone numbers and said, see what you can get. I said, okay, sounds good. How about if I get their network password? Because if you get somebody's network password, you're basically them on the, you know, their internal network. You can get through VPNs. You can, you know, do all kinds of fun stuff. And they said, great, go for it. So what I did was I found the company's VPN page, which is basically their way that you can go from, you know, the outside internet to their inside network. So it's kind of like then you're sitting inside the company just by putting in their username and password. And that's what I wanted to get from them. So what I did was I found that for the company, created an exact copy of it on a, you know, server that I controlled, and then I kind of started calling them on the phone and being a little bit mean. I was like, we were just hacked. And a lot of our usernames and passwords are dumped out there on the internet. So we created this web page where you can check. You just have to go through our VPN. Just got to log in, and the next page will tell you, is your username and password in there? And of course, I made the next page always say, no, yours is not in there, so that way nobody panicked or anything like that. And I said, if you could just don't tell me any of your information, I don't need to know your username and your password. Never share your password with anybody. All you have to do is go to this page that you're used to seeing all the time, put in your username, your password, and it'll tell you. And they're like, great, let's go do that. I also had a database hooked up to the back end that was capturing all that for me, and 64% of them did it. So that was kind of neat the way that worked. Fortunately, I had one person who was like, I'm on the security team here. I know exactly what you're doing. I was like, oh, what do I do now? I can't like admit it. So I was like, well, that's really good. I'm glad that you're aware of this. You're really on top. But I need to check a box here. Can you just do it for me? And she said, oh, yeah, I'll do it. And she kind of walked through it. She didn't actually do it, though. But I noted in the report, I'm like, she called me right out. She was great about it. And there were other people. I got one person on the phone. She's like, what is it that you want me to do? And I could hear a manager in the background, don't do that. It's like, okay. So I called that out to him. Like, that's excellent. That's exactly what you want. So that's the kind of stuff that I might do in a certain day. So what are we trying to achieve? What are my goals? Why does a company hire me? Well, they want me to find weaknesses in the system. So some of these kinds of things that I might look at, I'll look at your servers. Do you have old servers? Are they currently patched? We always hear, keep everything current. Well, that's kind of the things that I look for. Because if I see that things aren't patched, or they're a little bit older, I'm going to go look at the patches and figure out what did those patches fix. Because if those patches fixed a way for me to get in, and you don't have that patch, I'm going to use that way to get in. Sometimes there's even open access. One that I was on a couple weeks ago was kind of sad, I guess, a little bit. I was working for a bank. And as I'm kind of going through, anybody know what FTP is? So the file transfer protocol, we know that it's not secure. So for some reason, this bank had FTP access to hundreds or thousands of their customers' account numbers. And what made the FTP even better is usually FTP requires a username and a password, right? No. I just opened up a browser. I knew what the IP address was. I typed in right up in the URL, FTP with the IP address. There it was, hundreds, thousands of that kind of stuff. It's like, oh man, come on, this is too easy. Overly helpful web pages. Sometimes web pages tell you exactly where to go. There might be information. There can be passwords right in there as well. Any kind of suboptimal policies, the way that, maybe your password policy is a little bit too weak. That kind of thing can sometimes make it a little bit too easy. Sometimes people think, well, we have a great password policy. We require at least 8 characters, 1 uppercase, and 1 number. That sounds pretty good, right? Until we try out password 1 with an uppercase P. That fits. Okay? So sometimes these policies are going to be things that you want to think a little bit further along as to what's going to be a little bit more optimal for the company. Okay? What else are we trying to achieve with this? Well, we're trying to figure this out before the bad people do. So that way, when I finish testing the whole network, I can hand over a report to you and say, these are a lot of the things that I found that the bad guys are also going to be looking for. So that's kind of the goals of what we're trying to do. People often ask, isn't it tempting to go and do this kind of stuff for evil? Or can you hack my Facebook page? It's like, well, dark side has cookies. It's tempting. But no. Part of that is I don't mind paying for my own rent, and I don't look good in orange. Okay, at least you guys are still awake. There's also this thing called the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that mandates that any time that you do these kinds of things to a computer, to a network, or anything like that, that you have explicit permission. So that's another thing that kind of keeps me away from those Darth Vader cookies, is that I'm only going to do these kinds of things to computers and networks that I have explicit permission for, and that's kind of what my company sets up for me. So first step, the kind of things that I'm looking for. This is going to be the kind of the steps that we go through when we do an assessment, when we do a penetration test. So if you've ever hired penetration testers or thought about it, these are the kinds of things that the good ones should probably be doing. The first one is reconnaissance and OSINT. OSINT is open source intelligence. Open source means it's free, it's available, anybody can find it if you know where to look. And that's where to look is usually just Google things. There's search engines out there that make these kind of things available, and it's all free. So if it's freely available, it's going to fall under this OSINT. You'll probably sometimes see other sources out there that say, you can look up any person, find their job history, and you just have to pay them. That's not open source intelligence. That's, a paid service. But this whole OSINT, open source stuff, all free, all open. It's kind of amazing some of the stuff that might be out there and available. One such example, if you kind of go looking for these kinds of things, might be just the passwords. That's really what I'm probably going to be looking for. This is a site called Pastebin. And if in your own time, just for fun, you kind of Google for Pastebin and passwords, you'll find lots and lots and lots of these kind of things. I just kind of smudged a lot of those out because this was a social network that you're probably familiar with. And I have no idea if any of these passwords are still valid. And everybody who uses a unique, strong password for every single site, raise your hand. wow, that's awesome. So there's no password reuse whatsoever anywhere. That's great. Unfortunately, your users don't do that. So that's another reason that I kind of smudge these out, because we have no idea if some of these people are reusing those passwords somewhere else. So we kind of hide those as well. And even if we're able to find some of these, like a bunch of years ago, there was a big password dump from LinkedIn, and we find out that a lot of those really don't work so much against LinkedIn anymore, but they work in other places. So those are some of the things and places that we look for this kind of information. So Pastebin, it's open source intelligence. It's available. It's freely out there for us to look at. Another thing that we do right at the beginning to try to figure out what you have in your network is we're going to run, this is a scan of a server. This is called Nmap. I'm going to show you some of the tools that we use through this and kind of give you an idea of what their output looks like. So this is a scan of one server that I had set up for myself, and I ran this Nmap scan against it, and what it tells me is which services are running on there. Because once I get an idea of which services are running, now I can kind of figure out which ones maybe could best be brute forced, kind of force my way in, or which ones might be a little bit weak. We see some of the ones that are running up there. We mentioned FTP earlier. We probably don't want our domain services open to the internet. That's kind of how we're giving out access and giving out permissions to all the other machines. MySQL, some of the database services might be things that you don't want open to the internet, because that's going to be something that people are going after and trying to brute force as well. So running something like this is going to be one of the first steps as well, just to try to get another idea of what kinds of services that might be running. Here's another tool that I use primarily for websites. It's kind of a funny name if you have never heard of this one. It's called Burp. So it's the Burp Suite tool. And what this one does is it gets me a scan or a whole spider of a website. So all I have to do is just kind of hook up this tool, Burp, to my browser, go to the top page of the site, and then just hit this button inside of Burp that says spider it, and it gets me everything that's in there. So at least then I have a whole big picture of everything that's part of your website. Some of the neat things that the professional or paid versions of Burp that does for you is it can also find vulnerabilities. So that's kind of nice as well, that as it's doing its spidering, as it's finding the whole list of different pages, it says, well, there's probably also this vulnerability on this page that you want to go take a look at. So you can kind of step right through with that. So here we are with the very beginnings. All right, so next question for you. What's your weakest link that you're trying to guard against? What's the biggest concern and thing that might keep you up worrying about protecting your information?
Staff, users.
Okay, probably your users. You put all kinds of protections in place. You have all kinds of firewalls, intrusion detection system. But then there's Dave. Because somebody's just going to call Dave and say, Dave, what's your password? And be like, oh, here's my password. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, they're on your internal network. So we also have, in addition, if Dave's pretty good, we have other ways to get usernames as well, because one of the things that we want to do, if we're going to do some of that brute force access to your system to try to get into it, is we really need valid usernames. So one of the ways that we can do that is through open source intelligence again. Think of how many people at your company are probably using LinkedIn. So I can just kind of go on LinkedIn, put the name of your company, and there's all the people. There are tools that are available also to us that can just kind of get that for me in a list. If I can figure out what your username format is, kind of munge those together a little bit, which quite often username formats might be similar to your email address. They might not. Some other searches, maybe on Pastebin, might tell you kind of what the username format might look like. Census is another way that we kind of guess. Some tools or some of your servers might tell if the username that got submitted is accurate. If I put in a username and just some kind of junk password, sometimes the server will say, that username does not exist. It's like, oh, okay, great. And then I try one that does exist, and it's like, well, that password is wrong. Great, now I know if I can validate usernames. So then I might just use the census. So I'll say, well, let's take the top 100, the top 500 last names, write a script that cycles right through A in the first name, B in the first name, C, and just go right through and let that service tell me, yep, these are your valid usernames. So once I have my list of valid usernames, now we can start going after those passwords. And remember, Dave might not have the strongest password. So that's the first step that we're trying to do, get a kind of idea of what sorts of things that you have, which people that you might have. Once we have those, we can go on to step 2, finding the vulnerabilities in your system. We can look for things like, maybe you've heard of some of these, like the SQL injection is a vulnerability against your database. So it's a way that we can just kind of put in specially crafted code, maybe in a URL, maybe into an input field that gets us access to the database, which could potentially get information back out or get the entire contents of the database back out. You saw the results from Nmap earlier. That was probably a little bit exaggerated. Hopefully nobody has that many ports actually open on one of their services. But that can also help me to kind of dig a little bit deeper to get an idea of which services that you are running and what types of things that I actually want to target. Responder is kind of a really neat tool. Responder is for your internal network. Sometimes people will give me internal network access so I can kind of act like one of your angry employees or something like that. And what it does is I can just kind of start it up inside the network, and there's some misconfigurations on some servers and some workstations where they just kind of beacon out looking for, where is this print server? Where is this other server in the network? And what Responder does is says, here I am. So if you want to log in, give me your username and password. And those other machines are kind of misconfigured just to hand them right back so they can automatically authenticate to these machines, which kind of helps. So a big part of this is kind of knowing how things work. Like in the beginning when I described that I spent 12 years building, I spent a few years defending, which really helps when you're then trying to break things. So the next part, once we find these vulnerabilities, is to try to demonstrate risk. The demonstration of risk is really what the people are looking for. So some of these things might not mean anything, and that's intentionally up here, okay? Because the real goal of what I want to try to find to do is how far can I get? What can I do to your website? How far into your network can I get? Because if I just kind of describe some of these things in a report, do you care if I get DA? I'm guessing most people don't know what that is. Do you care if I get a pop-up to work? Great, you made a pop-up on the screen. What if you can see a printer administration panel? It's like, okay, well, you got the printer administration screen. That doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, especially to the people that we're given the report to. So that's not really demonstrating the risk. What we need to do to demonstrate the risk is answer some of these questions. Is there more risk if I say, well, here's your email? Also, if we can get into your email, well, a lot of the things that like Outlook might have is a global address list. If I can get into one email account, well, a lot of times when you're at work and you start filling in somebody's name and Outlook just knows, does an autofill. Well, that's because it has the global address list and it knows everybody that's in the company. So if I have access to one, then I can, again, get back to the beginning part where I get the full list. Can we tell you passwords? That's one of the most fun things we do. And a lot of people will kind of think that's when we're done. Because once we can get full access to your system, once we can get a higher level account, one of the first things that we'll do is log into your central authentication servers and dump the whole password list. The good thing is those password lists are usually going to be encrypted, hashed, protected. They're not going to be just, here's the passwords. But we have other machines and the ability to kind of crack those, so we kind of come back with, here are the 60%, 40% of the passwords that we're actually able to get. Show you a list of customers, or like I described earlier, what I put on that report from the one that I mentioned before. Here's a whole bunch of your customers' account numbers. I'm sure that probably wasn't going to go over too well, especially if the bad guys were to find that and they contacted the customers as well. Screenshotting the desktop. Any of these kinds of things might scare people in terms of that's what the bad guys can do, and that's where we're actually showing risk, and that's where the penetration tester, the security consultant, should be able to show their actual worth by showing exactly what the risk is, how far that they were able to get, what sort of information that they were able to get as well. Okay? So the very last step is going to be the deliverable. That is the report, and that's where the penetration tester is going to show their worth. You hire somebody to do all this for you, and it does no good if they just kind of do it and they can't show you that they actually did it, or if they don't show you how to fix it. Okay? We want to make sure that we're showing step by step how we got this information. It's like, you got 60% of our passwords. How did you do that? It should be in there step by step. First thing I did was this, then the next step, all with screenshots, descriptions, and everything should be fully able to be reproduced. So that should completely demonstrate the risk as well. as well as some of the suggestions for remediation. You know, what are ways that we can probably fix this? Like I said at the beginning, I'm only in there for 5 days. So I don't fully understand your entire network and all the different business requirements that you might have. So I can't say, well, this is the only way, or this is the way that you need to fix it. So we just kind of give recommendations based on usually what the manufacturer or the vendor suggests. And then people will sometimes ask, well, do you fix it for them? Well, no. No. So that's really all that I do, is I give them the recommendations on how to fix it. They can come back and say, if we do this, is that going to remediate it? And sometimes I can say yes. Other times we'll say, we'll test it again for you and let you know. Because there might be some vulnerabilities where we have this specific block of code that we use to get into the system, and they see that in the report, like, oh, well, he used that block of code. Let's just kind of put a blacklist on that code. Maybe the code that we used was 1 = 1. So they type that in there literally. It's like, okay, well, that's great. You blocked 1 = 1, but 2 = 2 still works too. So they need to take it a little bit further. All right. So basically what I do, I'm trying to find the vulnerabilities in your system. I want to see how far I can go, just how bad they are. Be able to show you exactly how bad they are, what sorts of things that we can do with those, and then document it. Be able to come back to you and say, here it all is in writing. It should be something that weeks later you can still pick up the report and still is going to make sense. It should still all be in context, and hopefully things are going to be able to get fixed in that amount of time. And since this is what I do all day, the next week, start all over again with a new customer. Figured to throw in at the end a bonus slide. What's the one thing that you can take away from here and go back? And if you're in charge of the security, do this kind of thing. If you're not in charge, you can go back and ask your security people, are we doing this one thing? The guy at the conference said, if we're doing this one thing, that this would probably make things a whole lot better. There's a lot of things that would probably make your systems and your networks better, but one thing that I think would be pretty easy, and it makes my life miserable. Anytime I see this in place, I'm just like, oh, this is not going to be good. There's still sometimes ways around it, but not always the easiest. But if you put two-factor authentication in place, that makes my life miserable. Because two-factor authentication means that your users are putting in their username, their password, and then it sends them a text, probably on their phone. So me as a tester, I don't have their phone. So I can't say, yep, let me in. So for me, that's probably the one takeaway. If you want a second one, it's going to be passphrases. We do say, like I mentioned at the beginning, the passwords, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 number, and people can just do, uppercase P, password 1 to get around it. If you have a way that you can enforce passphrases, where all these kind of things are mixed in and there's no words actually in there, that's going to be a huge help as well. That's probably a little bit harder to actually enforce, so that's why I chose two-factor authentication as the one thing that I figured would be a good takeaway. And you can kind of go back and say, if we put two-factor authentication on all of our logins, that's going to stop a lot of stuff, and it will. And you might hear, well, we have to go buy that. You probably do, but if you don't have it already, to me, that's probably the biggest, easiest thing that you can put in place to kind of make my life and the bad guy's life miserable. That's what I got, so thank you for coming. Glad to see you all here.